AMD has finally done it. They've released the ultimate all-around CPU. I mean, it does everything, and it does it really well. But before I introduce it, I've got to take you all the way back to 2023, when AMD releases a very interesting CPU. It was similar to their previous generation 5800X3D, but with one key difference. It had double the cores. That was, of course, the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, and it was definitely an interesting chip because it promised great gaming performance while also offering very good performance in professional workloads. But it had one major flaw. While it was extremely good at gaming, it was notably worse at heavily threaded workloads when compared to the regular 7950X. Yet, they were the same price, so you had to pick whether gaming was more important to you or professional applications. Well, you don't have to pick anymore because I've got their new Ryzen 9 9950X3D. And like I said at the start, it's incredible at everything. And it's all thanks to their new 3D V-cache. See, one of the big reasons the 7950X3D was slower in higher threaded workloads is because the chipset with the 3D V-cache required lower clocks. So half the cores are slower than the other half. But because AMD found a way to put the cache below the processor cores, they can now get much higher clocks. But just how good is it? Well, before I get to that, let's go over the specs. Starting things off, AMD's 9950X3D is a 16-core, 32-thread CPU with a whopping 128 megabytes of L3 cache and 170-watt TDP. Now, that isn't much of a surprise, of course, but things get interesting when we talk clocks. As you can see here, it gets a base clock of 4.3 GHz and a boost of 5.7. That obviously isn't a surprise given the regular 9950X also comes with this, but don't forget that unlike the 9800X3D, the 9950X3D has one CCD with 3D V-cache and one without. So no, AMD didn't include 3D V-cache on both chiplets this time, but they also still turn half the cores off when you're gaming, so that cross-CCX communication likely isn't worth it anyways. But here's the thing, while they don't list it here, AMD confirmed to me that the clocks on the 9950X3D's V-cache chiplet get up to 5.5 GHz, which is a whopping 300 MHz faster than the current gaming champ, the 9800X3D. So does that mean AMD's new chip is the fastest gaming chip now? Well, let's find out. Starting things off, when compared to the 7950X3D at 1080p using the RTX 5090, the 9950X3D crushes it. I mean, it can really make a big difference here in games where the CPU is clearly bottlenecked, though of course that's with any CPU. Still, none of this is a big surprise. But how good does it do against the 9800X3D? Well, as you can see in the games I tested, AMD's new 9950X3D actually wins overall versus the 9800X3D, making it, at least in these benchmarks, the gaming champ. With that said, it doesn't win in everything. The 8-core chip actually wins in 3 out of the 7 games, though here's the thing. When either of them win, it's usually extremely close. I'm talking mostly within the margin of error here, meaning that while the 9950X3D wins overall, they're both essentially neck and neck. So unless there's a specific game that the Ryzen 9 does better at, and it's worth it for you to spend more for just a few FPS, it's not worth it for just gaming. And this actually brings me to a point when it comes to gaming that I still don't think a lot of people discuss enough. Your CPU is not anywhere near as important as your GPU. Remember that this performance difference was using an RTX 5090 at 1080p to eliminate the GPU bottleneck. Sure, it was at ultra in these games, but still, you're likely not going to play at 1080p with a 5090 unless you're big in esports games or something like that, which would make it a bigger deal, but for most, you likely won't see a big difference either way. Let's take Cyberpunk 2077 as an example. When comparing the 7950X3D to these new chips at 1080p, there is a pretty big difference here, but as soon as we move up to 1440p, that difference nearly vanishes. And if you had a slower GPU than the 5090, it would happen even sooner. Basically, if you already own, say, a 7950X3D for gaming, you likely don't need to upgrade. But if you do own it for professional workloads as well, you might want to. Because AMD's 9950X3D also completely crushes it at heavily threaded workloads. As you can see here, against the 7950X3D, AMD's new chip wins in everything. Whether it's multi-threaded or single-threaded workloads, I mean, it's really not even a competition. But that's of course not a big surprise. We should expect that from a new generation. But get this. I also compared it to my non-3D V-Cache 9950X, and while the 3D cache technically has lower clocks than the non-3D V-Cache, it was able to beat it there as well. I'm not sure if it's because my 9950X is on the lower side of the silicon lottery or what, but it's definitely impressive, especially because it beat it in everything I threw at it, other than Jetstream 2, but they essentially tied there, and that's just a benchmark for web applications anyway. At the end of the day, AMD's new Ryzen 9 9950X3D is a champ all around, and while its $699 price point is still fairly high, it's nice to see that AMD at least hasn't gone up in price. On the other hand, while it technically did beat the 9800X3D in the games I tested, it's not at all worth buying if you only game. The 9800 model is still the absolute best gaming chip for the price. I mean, it's not even close, but if you both game and use apps that like a lot of cores, you can't beat the 9950X3D.